the biggest news that's come out from today is this news from Suella Braverman, which was reported in the FT this morning. Okay, so the proposals include a new civil penalty for charities giving tents on public nuisance grounds, right? So it's not just moving people on. It's not just getting rid of their personal belongings if they are found in like the 10 areas inside cities, etc., etc. But it's also penalizing charities for distributing things that homeless people need to ensure that they can deal with the elements that they're forced to deal with in terms of homelessness. Now, this is obviously a big problem in the homelessness rate is rising during a housing crisis. So people who've not had to worry about things like whether or not they can house themselves have not been taking nicely to the fact that the areas which they go inside cities are more populated by homeless people. It's clearly become a bigger problem recently, given the massive increase, not just in house prices and in mortgage prices, but rental prices specifically. The private rental and also socially rented markets are both massively constrained due to undersupply and due to artificially constrained supply due to how much of it is in the hands of private sector landlords, meaning that way more people who would usually be in either temporary housing or would be inside social housing or would have a rental place that they now can't afford are more likely to be on the streets. So, given this is happening, there is plenty of room for a more draconian policy platform from the Conservatives to try to play to the fears of these people who worry about the increase in rough sleepers in their area. Now, the problem what we have is that, of course, this is not a solution to the problem. You don't solve the homelessness problem by penalizing homeless people. It's not like they have anywhere else to go, and it's not like we can you do put these people in prison or anything like that because all of the prisons are full. The prisons are so full that even people who've committed SA, for example, aren't even getting in line to go into the prison system because we've not got the space to be able to put them in. So the proposals are designed to replace elements of the Vagrancy Act from 1824, which criminalised rough sleeping and begging. The government had pledged to repeal the act, but now they're going to essentially pretend to U-turn, which I think is quite funny, or pretend not to U-turn. So they have already U-turned essentially, but by just replacing the act, they can still go forward with their manifesto pledge of repealing the act with just replacing the same pieces of that legislation with far more draconian stuff on the back end. The good charities have warned of a growing homelessness crisis caused by a combination of rising rents, the shortage of affordable housing, and the cost of living crisis, leaving more people vulnerable to eviction. Apparently, 300,000 households received help from their councils or were threatened with homelessness in the year to April 2023, a 7% increase on the previous year and 3% above pre-pandemic levels. She tweeted out about this, saying that there's some excellent words from her. The British people are compassionate. We will always support those who are genuinely homeless. But we cannot allow our streets to be taken over by rows of tents occupied by people, many of them from abroad, citation needed, living on the streets as a quote-unquote lifestyle choice. Now, I don't know about you, but given that we've seen a correlation between the increase in the rough sleeping, the increase in homelessness, with the increase in rental prices, with the issue of the housing crisis and the pandemic happening, and the fact that we have a cost of living crisis as well, I don't know what about this information would lead anybody to believe this was some kind of lifestyle choice. This doesn't make much sense to me.
But it is such a comforting fantasy.
Yeah.
We want to believe many things. I've worked in the charitable sector now for 20 years, and when you bring it up, people are begging to talk about that time that charity stole some money. They don't
Mm.
want to believe that charities really are good. They want to believe that they're criminal and wrong, and that people who work for them are just as craven as everybody else. And here we have that urge mixed with a very similar urge around homeless people. Oh, sure, there are some real homeless people out there, but most of the people you're seeing on the streets, it's some self-inflicted wound or some other reason one doesn't need to extend empathy.
Hmm.
So, while yes, it is fantastical, I think it serves a very important purpose for the holder.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that you point to this dislike of the charitable sector on top of
Mm.
the desire to want to individualize problems, to try and assume that there's no systemic fault here, when the whole point of the system that was kind of devised under David Cameron, the whole big society thing, was explicitly there so that the charitable sector would essentially deal with the shortfall from government austerity cuts, from moving more of the remit of dealing with the externalities of the failures of the market economy onto the charitable sector instead of being done by the state, because that's the libertarian dream, is that actually, we can strip away all of the state, because there will be some people amongst us who will be able to individually decide to be altruistic rather than being coerced through, so they call it, via taxation, to want to deal with these problems. But of course, the whole point of a market economy is it cannot deal with externalities on its own. And it also, when you over marketize an economy, it trains people to think under market forces, where they would therefore be less likely to then give to the charitable sector. So it's a kind of vicious cycle when, of course, the ideology that you've espoused there, people dislike the idea of charity, basically undermines the entirety of what they're trying with this whole hashtag big society, which again gets undermined here. So Suella moved on to say, unless we step in now to stop this, British cities will go the way of places in the US like San Francisco and Los Angeles, where weak policies have led to an explosion of crime, drug taking, and squalor. Nobody in Britain should be living in a tent on our streets. There are options for people who don't want to be sleeping rough, and the government is working with the local authorities to strengthen wraparound support, including treatment for those with drug and alcohol addiction. Now, this just isn't true. The idea that the government is working with local authorities to deal with the homeless problem is the opposite of true. Now, I meant over the story a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's relevant that we bring this one back, which is English councils are seeking £100 million to avert the collapse of homelessness services, given that council cuts, the increase in homelessness, the problem with the cost of living crisis, and the strain on the rest of their services, coupled with the fact that they've had to sell off a bunch of capital investment that they now just don't have anymore as a source of revenue, means that they're already struggling to deal with the homelessness crisis. So it shows the government isn't helping, and in fact is exacerbating this problem by stripping local councils further of funding. Given a lot of these problems come out of the right to buy anyway and the lack of housing supply within the social safeties, through that in the social housing sector, means that when she comes to us and says that there are options for people who don't want to be sleeping rough, that's a lie. That's not true. It's just it's a complete inversion of reality. And she says British cities will go the way of places in the US like San Francisco and Los Angeles. Yeah, places where the housing is still too expensive and the government don't want to spend any money on actual solutions that would solve this problem, which is, of course, a housing first policy. There's a reason why Finland is one of the only countries in Europe where the rate of homelessness is falling, because they looked at this problem of people don't have any houses, and then they said, okay, let's give people some houses and put them in the houses. And then turns out you're dealing with drug and alcohol addiction, which is, as I've heard from, I don't know if you remember Summer when she used to live in Manchester, Ed.
Mhm.
She worked with the homeless in Austin, Texas. And of course, anyone who works in these areas will tell you is that, of course, drug and alcohol addiction will lead to things like homelessness. But of course, it's basically impossible to be able to deal with these addictions if you don't have a home in the first place. So people say, oh, if the issue is they've got into these addictions which has made them homeless, so we can't give them a home until they've fixed these things or they'll become homeless again. But of course, all that happens is that they don't actually deal with these drug and alcohol addiction problems. And on top of that, giving these people houses is cheaper than policing tent cities. It's cheaper than spending money on shelters, which of course don't actually solve the problem because it's not stable enough housing for them to deal with the underlying issues that led to the homeless problem in the first place. It's just, of course, this typical, as we've seen, neoliberal short-termism, which leads to failure to spend money at the first place, which moves on to a problem of having to spend more money to deal with the externalities of this problem that's been created through austerity, through budget cuts, through cutbacks to the social safety net and to what we provide from the government and from local authorities.
Another lens for you. Cast your mind back to the 2012 American presidential election, back when they were still fun, you know?
Yeah,
And there was this beautiful moment where all the Republican candidates were on stage, and one of the Pauls, I can't remember if it was Paul the Younger or Paul the Elder, the Libertarian candidate, was having a pretty deep run.
Ron Paul.
Yeah. And the question was, if a young man who does not have health insurance gets a fatal illness, what should happen? And all of the Republicans on the stage hummed and hawed and said, well, it's very difficult. And then it got to Ron Paul and he said, that man should die.
Yeah.
And there is a consistency there that one must admire, but
Mm.
also that would make sense. Financially, homelessness with a welfare state is such a terrible option.
Yeah.
If you just let them die, that fine, economically that works. If you look after people, you need to look after them. Homelessness exists in this weird halfway house. I believe you'll probably know the stats better than me, but it's about £100,000 per homeless person per year is the
Yeah.
taxpayer burden.
Yeah.
Yeah, it exists because there is cruelty, but not enough cruelty, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I see what the point that you're making there. It's
Yeah.
because they can't be so cruel as to let them die, right? Because we've got the social safety net, as you say. But there's this level to which the only a certain amount of provision is good enough, is acceptable to give homeless people, right? In some ways, I think the homeless people, in some ways, are essentially some of the most oppressed people under capitalism, some of the most hard done by under capitalism, because they just never get the actual support they need to leave this vicious cycle. They get kind of depersonalized in the way and dehumanized in the way that we've seen here from these statements by Suella Braverman. But people always want to look like that they still care, even when that rhetoric reaches this fever pitch, which is why you get homeless shelters. Because it is enough care to make it look like you're doing something. But of course, we both know it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem at all. And it's more expensive than solving the problem. Because
It-
half of the time, we're both utilitarians, right? We get that the point of social spending is to achieve some kind of end. When when that's not how a lot of these people believe that these things are. They believe that there's some level that people should or shouldn't be justified in being able to accept, which giving somebody a home to live in is above that line that they're willing to let people accept. And where you draw that line of what the state should or shouldn't be providing to people essentially gratis differs from person to person, and that's where the rhetoric on this can lead people into changing their position so to put that line lower. That's what the rhetoric is there for. That's why we describe these things as being quote unquote lifestyle choices. Because then it means that, okay, well, if they've made that choice, then there's no need for the state to step in. Because otherwise we're validating that choice by giving them more than just the basics of provision, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, the casting around for a reason to shut off empathy so frequently falls upon you didn't play the game correctly.
Mm-hmm.
There were rules, we wrote them down, you didn't follow them in a way that was advantageous to you, and thus I don't have to care anymore.
Yes. Yeah.
You see in so many places, obesity, I think, is a really good one. I don't have to care about the difficulty of being obese because they somehow brought it upon themselves, you know? Over and over again, it is a desire to shut off who we owe things to. And I wonder if part of it comes from things like being emotionally overloaded through the war. You only
Mm.
have finite empathy. if people were constantly in empathy burnout, it would clearly be in people's interest to find groups they no longer have to empathize with. I wonder
Yeah.
if sometimes this lies at the heart of the black and white thinking on the left, a desire to go, just tell me there are some people I don't have to care about, some positions I don't have to consider.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, I can see where you're coming from there. What I would say as well is it's very frustrating that there was an interview with Jeremy Corbyn on the Newsagents podcast about a year ago, I think this was. And he was asked by Lewis Goodall during the interview what would the first thing that he would have done when he was Prime Minister. And he replied
Uh-huh.
with that today rough sleeping and homelessness would end. There'd be no more homeless people in the country. I mean, we have more empty houses than we have homeless people, right? If you rethink how we understand how the economy and how the housing market might work, then we can literally just put everybody in houses. In fact, during the pandemic, there were no homeless people. The state decided, okay, actually, instead of spending all this money on shelters, we can spend exactly the same amount of money on hotels and put these people up in hotels. We did that. We did that during the pandemic, and then we just stopped when we clearly showed that homelessness was a political choice. It was a political choice that people were taking, and I find it very frustrating that given the option of there being no more homeless people paying less money and paying more money to continually allow having a government that would demean and demonize these people, I find that very sad. I know that's a bland opinion, but I just think that there was something that we could have done differently, and the country didn't end up doing it. I think that's very unfortunate and quite sad.
There's a ratio that keeps cropping up over and over again in my research, and it is this: the top 1% get half.
Hmm.
And it seems to, whenever you look into wealth and what have you, it seems to keep averaging out to about that. And one of the really interesting ones is golf courses. The total area of golf courses in the UK is a little bit less than the total area of all the residential housing.
Hmm.
They're about the same, and about 1% of the population play golf. If
Yeah,
you look at a map of Manchester, there's a lot of golf courses in
true.
surprisingly central positions. It Homelessness is because of the rules of the game on so many levels.
Mm,
So much has to go wrong for the game to fail someone that much, and yet there's more and more of it around. What does that say about how we have constructed things?
yeah, exactly, exactly. Like you can say all that you want about the Soviet Union, right? Plenty of criticisms, but at least people had houses to live in the Soviet Union. At least people did. At least there was very little homelessness, right? Because housing was 5% of your income, and there was lots of it. Not great housing, not particularly nice ones, but at least people had roofs over their heads, right? They had constructed the game so that nobody was homeless. What I would like to,
Yeah, and the advantage
yeah,
of gulags is, as opposed to prisons, because they're mainly open air, they never really fill up. You could just keep sending people to them. Yeah.
what I wanted to point out as well on top of this, I think I've understood the reason why they're doing this. The reason why that they're doing this specifically is because we need to talk about this in the lens of the fact that in the wake of the migrant crisis, lots of space is being used in hotels in this country to house migrants, people who've arrived irregularly, asylum seekers, in a bunch of hotels. And so, given that this rough sleeping problem has exploded, there's a way of being able to both angle this in, dovetail this in between a lot of asylum seekers who are actually the rough sleepers trying to get access to whatever kind of free charitable giving they can have, ruining our streets or whatever, try and demonize this other, even more insignificant minority as far as they're concerned. And on top of that, once people are talking about the homelessness crisis, juxtaposing that against the, oh, well, we can actually afford to put all of these asylum seekers in hotels at the cost of £1 million to the taxpayer, yet we can't afford to get people off the streets at the same time. Therefore, there's this dichotomy between people who agree with the government's line on this one and people who can be kind of hoodwinked through the kind of propaganda surrounding this into saying, well, hang on a minute, how would you do playing off these minorities against each other? This divide and conquer between, well, we can house refugees, we can house asylum seekers, but we can't house British people who have become homeless too. Which is a really kind of nasty political game, but I guess a smart one if you were trying to find any reason that people would vote for you come the next election. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.